different view of the panel this
Yeah, we
time.
were
Good,
yesterday,
good.
so
Actually,
I wanted to
from
be
that,
space,
I started
faculty on the side.
I'm a little unruly, Lexi.
Yeah. There's more room to nap over here.
Okay, well, it's my pleasure to announce our last panel of today, BTOP, Towers, Routers, and Middle Mile Fiber. This panel will discuss broadband development and how we can bring gigabit internet to the entire state. It will discuss the issues we face with this development in West Virginia and how to hopefully overcome these obstacles. I'll now turn it over to our moderator, Chris Walters.
Thank you, Lexi. Last panel, last day. Thank you all for coming and showing up. I really appreciate that. I'll tell you a quick brief about myself, and I'll let Charlie introduce himself and Rob afterwards. I'm Chris Walters. I'm sure you all know my brother Ron. I am a former senator for the state of West Virginia. I got elected to the Senate when I was 26 years old. I'm the youngest senator in the history of the state of West Virginia when I was elected. I served Vice Chair of Finance Committee, Chair of Transportation and Infrastructure, and Vice Chair of Government Organizations Committee. In the Senate, I held more chairmanships than any other member of the entire legislature. In Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, we had a lot of discussion about broadband infrastructure and broadband technology. I put together different pieces of legislation dealing with the fact, and we'll talk more about that today. But in those pieces of legislation, it really led us to the conversation of where we stand as a state. I'm married to my wife, Elizabeth. I've got two children, Aubrey and Wesley, who are 3 and 7 years old. My wife is out of town, has been out of town since Wednesday, and I've been watching my kids ever since, and all the way through Monday, so I may be a little disheveled today. And I have to keep my phone kind of nearby in case the babysitter freaks out or anything goes wrong. And I own Capital Insurance Group, specialize in all types of insurances. Also own Structured Financial Associates, where we handle structured settlements on the back end of legal suits and help with the finalization of suits and mediation. I also do mass tort administration, where I administer large class actions and help with finalization of those. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Charlie.
I don't know how to follow that. I was elected president of my 8th grade homeroom. That's been a little while, I'm afraid. I've been in the telecommunications business since 1982. And for those of you who are familiar with the Green decision, that was about 3 or 4 years before we had real divestiture in the telecommunications business. So I've been through all of these gyrations of the industry from what was called Carter phone, when it first became legal to own your own telephone equipment. Believe it or not, that used to be illegal. It was days and days before cell phones. Everything was wireline in those days. I was in the business when equal access to long distance first came about, and that meant that you could select your own long distance carrier without having to dial a special access code. And to give you a frame of reference, in those days, a long distance telephone call from Charleston to Logan, first minute was 50 cents. Second minutes were 25 cents, and today you can call across the globe for free or less. So that's what I've seen, and you can just call me Pawpaw because I've been through all of that. Today, I am the Vice President of Government Relations and Special Projects with a little West Virginia company down in Putnam County called Alpha Technologies. 5 years ago, we bought Union Carbide's global data center at the tech park down there. And in order to monetize that for the cloud services that we wanted to do, we've had to build our own fiber because we can't get the circuits that we wanted to get. So right now, I'm leading a project to build 35-mile fiber ring around Charleston, South Charleston, back to our data center. And now it's Rob's turn.
Rob Hinton. I am the Executive Director of the Upshur County Development Authority, and that is the job that pays the bills. And the job that is a volunteer job is chairman of the West Virginia Broadband Enhancement Council. I do not have a background in telecommunications. I did not come from a telecommunications company, and if on my resume I have the least telecommunications experience of anyone on this panel, probably. But the important thing is that 6 years ago, roughly 6 years ago, I was in a meeting with a couple of major carriers, a local college, and a development group. We were talking, well, they were talking about broadband. They were talking about copper. They were talking about coaxial. They were talking about fiber. They were talking about wireless spectrum. They were talking about all these things that I had no idea what they were talking about. At that point, I made a decision that there was obviously some validity to enhance broadband and economic development and the future of economic potential that West Virginia can have if we have better broadband. So I became kind of a student of broadband and the technology that surrounds it, which ended up leading to spearheading a project in Upshur, Randolph, and Barber County to expand wireless technology in the area. The mechanism that we went after was a grant that would maximize at $3 million, and it also allowed for the incumbent provider, which an incumbent provider is basically your telephone provider in your state, to block the grant depending on what areas they were going to go in and serve. In doing that, we ended up picking our area and trying to make it as big as possible. The bigger the area, the harder it is for them to argue that they're going to go into all those areas. So we had about 1,000 square miles that we ended up defining as our area. We included 26 new telecommunication towers, and we're upgrading 9 existing towers. There was a USDA Community Connect grant, and it was the largest Community Connect application and funded project in the history of the program by virtue of area of coverage, number of residents, which is right around 9,500, and number of homes, which is right around 3,000. We're under that project right now, and it took USDA a year to review that application. It's a very long process. That ended up getting me into speaking engagements with legislatures in as far as former Senator Walters in what West Virginia may need in order to improve its ability to connect, and then ultimately, I guess that's what led to the governor appointing me on the council, and then the council appointing me as chairman. So that's kind of how I became in the world of broadband, and just happy to be here.
We're happy to have you here, Rob. He might be soft-spoken, but whenever it's come to the topic of economic development, especially for your county, and also in the ways of bringing fiber access to multiple West Virginians, you've been very outspoken, and it's been very appreciative, and that's why we've seen so many things come forward of your work, and your work as well, Charlie. So I want to start with talking to Charlie for a little bit. Well, let me back up real quick. To give you all the lay of the land for broadband in West Virginia, in 2013 a study came out that said West Virginia, as far as broadband connectivity, ranked 52nd in the United States behind Guam and Puerto Rico. We are the least connected state of anywhere else. West Virginia, as far as speeds, were the slowest in the nation. If you look at the fastest growing industry, 1 out of every 3 jobs are connected to, new jobs in the United States are connected to the fiber technology center. You look at Chattanooga, Tennessee. Chattanooga, Tennessee is being called the Silicon Valley of the East Coast. They are the fastest growing economy, and it's because they created the fastest fiber hub anywhere in the United States. They did so by accident, which is extremely funny, but they decided that instead of having people go out and check every single meter in town on every single home, that they just built fiber to every single home, and they could check and monitor the smart meters at their house that way. And the government and the electrical company accidentally built the fastest, most affordable fiber optic system in the United States, which has completely turned around their economy. Amazon has located there. Cisco has located there. Now, majority of the technological hubs have located in Chattanooga, Tennessee, of all places. And we saw this, and we saw the ability that they were attracting businesses. And we're not talking about just large, huge manufacturing warehouses, but small businesses as well. You know, you look at West Virginia, you look at our topography, everyone continuously asks, where are the manufacturing jobs? And as a rebuttal, when we were in the legislature, we'd say, well, where's our flat land? You can't build a manufacturing distribution center on the side of a mountain. So West Virginia has to think smaller while looking at the big picture. And that's why we discussed the possibilities of fiber and broadband and what it could do for our economy here. We still have a long way to go, but there's a lot of interesting things occurring in the United States, and we're very well positioned to take advantage of many of them. Starting with what Charlie has done with his company, you all purchased the old Union Carbide data center. Cybersecurity is quickly becoming some of the largest legal suits in the United States. You all hear about all the cyber breaches that are occurring. Data centers like this is where hospitals are sending all their data to so that they're passing on the liability. So whenever it comes to data centers, Charlie, could you talk about the data center, the type of cybersecurities you all offer, and why this new trend is occurring, and what you guys are doing to assist in these avenues?
I think we should get out of the business after that. Yes, we'll go down that road for a moment. There are, I wouldn't presume to tell you about the law, but I can tell you where we protect ourselves most vigorously. There is a security protocol called HIPAA High-Tech. And HIPAA High-Tech is a data center. You can't really call it a certification, but you pass an audit. And once you've passed this audit, it says that you have the policies and the procedures in effect to protect your data. And these things are monitored very, very closely to make sure that everything that we do is in compliance. Everything that I do, and I have nothing to do with the data center in terms of the operation of the data center, but every employee at Alpha has to go through security awareness training and recertification of that training periodically, at least once a year. We have to change our passwords every 90 days to everything that we do. I mean, this whole list of protocols is really developed by the CPA firms. And so we have the HIPAA High-Tech, which takes care of the medical records, and we have a thing called ISO 27001, which is an international protocol. And then we have, your lawyer's going to love this story. There's something called SSAE 16, Type 1 and Type 2. Type 1 says that you have the policies and procedures, and those have been audited by the accounting firms, and there's a very rigorous process you go through. So there are hundreds of organizations that have SSAE 16, SOC 1. SOC 2 says you actually follow the protocols. Believe it or not, only a small percentage of the people who have the protocols are actually audited and certified that they actually follow the protocols. I always thought that was kind of ironic. So there are these things that we do to make sure that we don't get sued, so we can prove that even if it all comes off the rails, we follow the protocol, so it wasn't really our fault. These things are getting more and more sophisticated every single solitary day. And we know that we have state-sponsored terrorists and state-sponsored hacking around the globe that lives to breach national security and to breach corporate secrets and potentially shut down our infrastructure. So we're hearing those stories on a day-to-day basis, and if you believed every one of them, you'd never sleep again. So you just go about your business on a day-to-day basis and do the best you can. But I'd like to digress for a moment back to a comment that Lexi made about bringing gigabit to everybody. And Rob had the audacity to suggest that.
Made the papers.
It did.
It did make the papers.
And it was not well received by people who provide those services. And it occurred to me at some point in time after you tell these stories a few times, do people really understand what a gigabyte is? You don't know what it is, Lexi, but you know you want it, right? Yeah. it's like the 1080i TV sets. I don't know what it is, but I gotta have it. So let me give you just a visual illustration here, and these are actually to scale, as luck would have it. If this straw represents 1 megabyte, this is a meg. Now, let's pretend for a moment that you have a business, and part of your business requires that you transfer data from your business to somebody else. Every day, you've got these transactional things to do. And let us suppose that the volume of business that you need to transport is an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and it's full of water, and you've got your work day, and it all has to go through here. Okay? So that's going to be really frustrating, and that's going to take a really long time to get that done. So that is 1 meg. Rob, would you agree that on your best day, you're going to get 10 meg out of DSL?
Are the newspapers here?
No.
In a laboratory setting, you could do it all day long, but
5?
today when it's raining, no,
Would you give me 5?
maybe.
Maybe 5. Okay. Trying to bargain with the devil here. Okay. No. Okay, so here's a meg. Okay, the average DSL connection on a really good day is 5 meg. Okay, and it's advertised at 10.
Now it's advertised at 25.
25. The man is up the beyond 25 meg. Okay, so here is 1 meg. Here's 5 meg, 10 meg, we just bypassed that puppy. We're at 25 meg, okay? That's a gig. There's the comparison, there's the goal. Any questions on that? Okay.
I was wondering what that was here for.
You thought I was going to bake a cake.
I thought it was like an air filter off an old vehicle.
It's not, and I had to scour the hardware stores and building supply stores for weeks to find something that was that size that I could bring into here. And it doesn't paint very well, but you know, there we are. So, Lexi, to your point, that's what a gig looks like. And so what will happen, the reason this is important to us, let's say that we're in a small town that has the opportunity to support what we call the back office operations, maybe claims processing if you're an insurance company, or maybe people are doing some kind of work where they're doing calculations and the information has to come back and forth. You can't get the information out of your town. And if you've got 15 employees trying to work on that, that's an issue. There was a guy in Huntington, West Virginia, who worked for the film industry, and his job was to go through the Spider-Man movie and digitally remove all of the little wires that Spider-Man is supported by and flies around on. And he did his best, and he couldn't make it work. So he had to move to North Carolina, where he could get more help on that. And my understanding is that his business is growing by leaps and bounds. And we have in Charleston, West Virginia, a media company that
Motion Masters.
Motion Masters, and is there a Bow Wow channel or a dog channel or something on one of the things? Anyway, it's a
Animal Planet.
No, not
No?
quite. There's a specific channel for dogs, and she does the editing for this. And what she has to do is they used to just mail the hard drives backwards and forwards to the company, but they wouldn't accept that anymore. So every once in a while, they'll do the edits, and they'll bring a hard drive over to the data center, and we'll download the thing for them. So we can't create these jobs in these smaller markets that are what I call knowledge workers if we can't move the data in and out of town. So that's my pitch on why gig's a good idea, Lexi.
And the other thing, just to dovetail on what you kind of explained with the megabit and the size that services are sold, you'll find interesting that telecommunication providers, broadband providers, they sell best case service. Okay, so you may buy a package, you may buy 50 megs, but it's best case, and they oversubscribe, which means that they'll put more people on a network and oversell the capacity they have. So it's like an airplane having 100 seats, and they sell 300 tickets and hope that only 100 people show up. I mean, that's no joke, that's how it is. The reality is that at some points in time, depending on the volume of traffic and demand on that network, you may get 50 or you may get 10. And there's nothing that stops, from a residential service standpoint, there's nothing that stops a company from selling that way. It's really ultimately something that has to change. Obviously, we've got to get connected first. The other thing, in regard to what Charlie said, I did make the comment that our goal needs to be a gigabit connection. If you're going to set your goals, you might as well set them high. Because if you don't achieve that high goal, you may achieve something that's at least close to that. The other thing that goes into play is not only just the businesses that we could recruit to the state, it's not only the jobs that we can recruit to the state, but it also is the businesses that we have here currently, that are currently operating. We are a data center investment company. About a year ago, made a comment that we're in the first inning of cloud computing. And I really didn't believe him until I went to Microsoft and spent a couple of days in Microsoft and just saw the things they were doing. I can't even put into words the capabilities that Microsoft Azure, A-Z-U-R-E, has from a standpoint of artificial intelligence, business improvement, efficiency, analytics, everything. But it's all cloud-based, which means that you have to have a connection to get to a server that is probably nowhere close to where you are and bring that information back. And all of these tools that help a business run more efficiently and more effectively, which then equals more profitably, are all going to be cloud-based. And just like Charlie said, as simple as someone that's running a one-man shop and needs to upload and download data, an entire business that's trying to be profitable and be in a global marketplace and be able to do business from anywhere, because that's really what we're able to do, is we're able to do business from anywhere, which makes West Virginia a really attractive place. We need to improve that connectivity. It's just, we're going to either succeed and progress, or we're going to regress.
Well, Rob, during the previous administration, there was a grant called Connect America funding that came out from the federal government. And their requirement in Connect America funding was only 10 meg. And it went to our incumbent provider in West Virginia. So when the federal government is stating that all that's needed is 10 meg for the grant funding to rural communities, how do we get beyond that, and how do we encourage the incumbent provider to provide more than that?
Wow, that's a question. So why does the federal government make it so they hand out funding and subsidize and only require a 10 meg? So let's back up a little bit. The federal government, FCC, Federal Communications Commission, they are the entity that oversees telecommunications and now oversee broadband and internet access. They have defined broadband over the years, and it has continually gone up. It wasn't 4 megs down and 1 meg up for a pretty long time. And then it went from 4 megs down to 1 meg up. It went from there to 25 megs down to 3 megs up. The same FCC that defines broadband is the same FCC that has what's called the Connect America Fund which is funding that is every telecommunication operator puts money into what's called a universal service fund. And the money comes out of the universal service fund to pay for and subsidize high cost or high investment areas. Areas that mostly are rural, and that mostly a provider, if they would go in and build out, they're never going to get a return on their investment because there's not enough customers to balance out the cost of the investment. CAF funding, ironic as it may be, is done on a measurement of 10 by 1. So even when the FCC says that broadband definition is 25 by 3, they consider an unserved area or underserved area as not having 10 megs by 1 meg. And they only require the recipient of Connect America funding to put in service that can provide at least 10 by 1. So if you're thinking in your head about how antiquated or how maybe ignorant that statement may sound, basically what ends up happening is that you end up having a cyclical system that we continually spend the same amount of money or the same money in the same areas playing catch up. Whereas if the FCC required a higher standard from the individuals receiving basically free money, then we would basically make an investment and be done. Kind of like when we did the electrification across the United States. We did not put in power lines that could only handle 30 amps. We put in a system that was scalable. And with telecommunications, we're not really putting a system in that's scalable. We're putting a system in that's going to max out. Most of the activity that has happened with the CAF funding in the past has been what's called a DSL upgrade. Basically, they will take a box and they will stick it on a pole, and they will try to amplify the ability of twisted pair phone lines. How many have messed around with a phone line before? Yeah. How many have seen the inside of a phone line?
How many have tapped your boyfriend's
Okay, so you've seen the inside of the phone line, so you know how thin those wires are, okay? And how many have seen a cable line, like copper cable? Okay, so you notice the difference in thickness, okay? Cable, coaxial, you can put a lot more information and data over. The phone lines become so, they're just, the capacity is limited, and that's why they were so small, is all they had to worry about was voice data. Well, they used the DSL, DSLAMs to try and amplify the ability to send a signal and repeat it, and send a signal and repeat it. The problem is that those lines are 50 plus years old. And that's usually why you can get 25 or 50 megs, even 100 megs over a twisted copper pair in a laboratory setting on new devices and so on and so forth. But out in the field, it just doesn't happen. And what has happened with the CAF funding is that they've gone out and they've put DSLAMs on and claim that they can get 10 megs or 25 megs. So how do we encourage our incumbent provider to strive to serve scalable infrastructure? I don't know the answer to that. That's a tough one. I think that you have to kind of go back to the drawing board, regroup, and analyze how you can encourage communities and how you can encourage small to medium-sized providers to do kind of have a mission-driven process in how they deliver broadband throughout the state of West Virginia. One of the things that the council has done is we've looked at how the state has been successful in water and sewer expansion in the state of West Virginia. Appalachian Regional Commission, United States Economic Development Administration, and HUD, Housing and Urban Development, over the past 50 years have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in water and sewer infrastructure. And how it's structured is that the communities are the agents that come up with the projects because they know what their community needs. They come up with the projects, they partner with a public service district or a municipality or a private company like American Water, and they go after funds to expand water and sewer. And they've done it successfully over the years. So why can't we do the same thing with broadband? So one of the things in the transition team from transition team for Governor Justice that I recommended that be placed on his agenda was to take small city block grant money. The state receives $12–13 million in small city block grant. Take a portion of that funding and set it aside for broadband. We'll create a program so communities can go after money for broadband. We ended up getting $1.5 million. Our goal was to get 25%, but we got 1.5, so we're not going to be upset that we didn't get that we only got 1.5. We're happy. We created a program. We had a training workshop that we put together to educate as far as how to create a broadband project. Brought in resources from outside the state on consulting and things of that nature. We had 12 applications in our first round of funding this year, and 27 counties will be impacted. So I don't know if you're familiar with West Virginia, but we have 55 counties at the current moment until they consolidate. So that's half of the counties in West Virginia, just on $1.5 million. Most of it's planning, but that's not necessarily a bad thing because we've got a plan, then we've got to implement. So next year, obviously, we'll hope to get $3 million. And the next year after that, we want to be equal, $6 million and $6 million. $6 million for broadband, $6 million for water. So to answer your question, Chris, in a really long-winded way, we kind of have to act as if our incumbent provider is not here.
Understood. Charlie, you got new props for us?
do.
What do we have?
I love the props.
I love the props.
What I have here are pieces of fiber optic cable. Now, the thing you really have to understand about one of the real problems about the expansion of broadband in West Virginia really comes into a couple of different things. The first is we have a real, outside of our metropolitan areas, we have a very sparsely populated location. So to run the infrastructure out to these people, as Rob pointed out, it's just really expensive, and that's where the Connect America funds come in and the subsidies come in to get this done. In the more urban areas, competition from the providers is really quite fierce, and the incumbents do some really tricky little things to keep providers out and to keep competition out, because we pay significantly more for broadband in West Virginia than we pay in other places, and they'd like to keep those margins. So the most common way of getting fiber from point A to point B is to hang it on a utility pole, and that sounds like a really good idea. And it is in most cases, except that there are rules that govern how utility poles get used. And if you've got another provider on the pole, this can get very complicated. There's a deal between Appalachian Power Company and the other utilities, a couple of electric utilities in the state. And this deal goes back decades, that the lowest person on the pole is always the incumbent telephone company, that they need more frequent access, so they get easier access. And then there are rules about how much space has to go between the providers. So usually the cable TV guys are next, and they've got to be a foot apart. So when other providers come by that are competitors to the cable company and competitors to the telephone company, they have to get permits, and they have to get a thing called make ready, and that means that the things that are on the pole already have to be rearranged in order to meet the code. And sometimes these things are built in such a way that it forces a make ready application. So when I went to look at building Alpha's fiber in Charleston, for those of you familiar with Kanawha County, there's a 2-mile space in Charleston between the foot of the Patrick Street Bridge and Thomas Memorial Hospital, which is on Division Street. So we went to Appalachian Power Company and said, you know, we'd like to get a price for hanging on these poles. And the pole attachments themselves are really quite reasonable. They're like $5 a pole a year or less. But they wanted $450,000 for the make-ready work for a 2-mile stretch. So you can imagine what it's going to cost to build competitive fiber when you want $450,000 just for the make-ready. And you can't do that. But guess what? You can bore it directionally for $12 a foot. And you can dig a ditch and put it in the ground and put the concrete back for $16 a foot. So why would you be on the poles? Well, that was the question that we had. So we did a little research. Got lots of props.
We're going to pass some of these props around too, so you can see what fiber is and everything.
We're going to do this.
Really cool.
So we put this conduit in ground. And the way we did this was kind of tricky. We have this technology called micro-trenching, and it cuts a little slot in the ground that's about 3 inches wide and about 12 inches deep. And we drop that conduit in the ground, and we blow this fiber through it. And it blows, we can blow about 5,000 feet at a time through this. You put 100 pounds of air pressure behind that, and a couple of guys just feed it through the tube, and it just whizzes down the road. Now the problem is this. Micro-trenching really only goes about 12 or 18 inches deep. But the highway department requires it to be 3 feet deep. So you can't use micro-trenching without some special permission. So last year we had House Bill 3093, which put micro-trenching into the legal status with the highway department. So the highway department couldn't understand exactly how it worked, but they were willing to take a chance on this one little project. And so then you have to pay for the right-of-ways. And we couldn't really figure out what the value of the right-of-way was, so the highway department traded us 4 strands of dark fiber for the right-of-ways, which made us really happy. That was an easy lift for us. But there was one other problem. And that problem is you can't be on the state road right-of-ways unless you're a utility company. And we really weren't a utility company. We're a provider, but all we really wanted to do was sell you our services in our data center. We just wanted to do the backups and the cloud services. So it took us 90 days, which I understand is a record, to go down to the Public Service Commission and persuade them that we needed to be a utility company, although we would never file a tariff, so we could take that certificate of convenience back to the highway department. And I know when the highway department told me that, they never expected to see me again. But I showed up 90 days later, and they're going, hey, that's cool. So they've been very, very accommodating, although Rob tells me that, you know, that things are going to get evil here before too much longer. That's not what he said. I beg your pardon. I'm teasing. But it's worked out really well for us, but that's the technology that we're using right now. So we cut this little trench in the highway, drop the conduit in it, cover it back up, do the restoration of the road service, and blow the fiber through. Now what you have in your hands there is 144 strands of fiber. And you could give everybody in the city of Charleston a gig on 144 strands, wouldn't you agree? Yeah, that'd be enough to do that.
Amazing, isn't it? You know, our state government's had so many.
You can keep the props, by the way.
There you go. All the things that he as a business in West Virginia had to do, all the hoops he had to jump through just to provide fiber in West Virginia. You talked about how competition is fierce and how companies are kept out of here. And I think you guys see that every day in your standard in our lives. Here in Monongalia County, how many cable companies do you have to choose from? Comcast. That's it. How many people in Kanawha County, how many cable companies, Kanawha County, largest county, the capital of West Virginia, Charleston, how many cable companies do they have to choose from? Just Suddenlink, one. Go to any other city of the same size in any other state, and that is not the same occurrence. It is more than one company. Where is the fastest, most affordable internet for any of the school systems in the state of West Virginia? It is in Parkersburg, West Virginia. Why is it in Parkersburg, West Virginia? Anybody know? They have 2 cable companies in Parkersburg, West Virginia. They have Cass Cable and they have Suddenlink, and they compete all the time. Parkersburg is a gig city, and Suddenlink keeps giving upgrades to their customers there. Guess what? If you live in Charleston, you use a certain amount of gigabytes, you're capped and you have to pay over and above in Charleston. But you go to Parkersburg, no caps, everyone keeps getting upgrades because there's competition. So the question is, how do we get competition into the state of West Virginia? How do we make ourselves more, more attractive? As Charlie mentioned, our population is spread so far apart. So to run a wire, there's 3 different types of fiber interstates, so to say. You have the national backbone, which carries everything. It's huge. Then you have interstates, just like our interstates here, and that's called middle mile fiber, and it runs as an interstate system. And then you have the off-ramps that go into the communities and hit the homes. That's last mile fiber. That's where they get their return on investment. If you're building a middle mile line, so if you're building an interstate of fiber from here in Morgantown down, let's say, to Flatwoods and then to Charleston, other than the few population centers, how many people are you actually hitting? Between Flatwoods and Snowshoe, West Virginia, Marlington, how many houses do you hit before you hit that population center? You don't hit many at all. So that's where these companies are having so much problems in West Virginia. People are saying, why don't we have competition out here in these rural areas? Well, how many homes are they hitting to get the money back? And that's where our biggest problem is. There was a project that was put together, and I open it to either of you all to speak. Everyone's familiar with Routergate, what happened with the routers. I'm sure you all have heard that story. There were 2 other projects that did not get as much publicity to the public. There was towers that were built, and we actually spent more money on building these towers than we spent on building the routers. And then we also had BTOP, which is a $42 million fiber project. Could you all give us an update on what's going on with the towers that were built during the project? And also, we do have one BTOP line that's being used, but why aren't BTOP monies being used? Why aren't those fiber strands being used by more companies to expand internet in West Virginia?
Well, I think they've been isolated, haven't they, Rob?
And also explain what BTOP is and what that was, if you would. Because that's a big chunk
I'll
to take out, guys.
respectfully decline to talk about BTOP or the towers.
Okay.
Specifically because it didn't turn out the way it was supposed to. And there's a lot of controversy. There's some serious litigation over that project. And to be honest, in my position as the council, it's a distraction to what we need to do in order to move forward. Now for others, it's very important, but for where I sit, it becomes a distraction. I will speak to things about competition.
Absolutely, please.
One of the reasons that West Virginia lacks in competition is because the internet is not in West Virginia. It is not in West Virginia. Okay, internet exchanges is where the internet is at. We have an internet exchange in Pittsburgh. There's an internet exchange in Columbus. There's an internet exchange, one of the largest internet exchanges in Ashburn, Virginia, which is right outside of DC, which is really, really close to West Virginia. And I think there's one in Louisville, right? Internet exchange in Louisville. So we have to go, so imagine, think of power, electricity, okay? So think of the only power plants that produce electricity were in all those areas. Then technically electricity is not in West Virginia unless we bring it in and ship it in. just like anything else that's on a vertical chain, all the hands or companies that transport or touch that electricity to bring it into the end user, which would be a resident or a business, they have to make a profit on that, on touching it, a handling fee, if you will. So the same applies to the internet. So you're buying bandwidth, you're buying connectivity, and it's measured in megabits and gigabits. Every company that transports that data from the internet exchange where you're going to get into the World Wide Web to bring it back to your home and go in and out, upload, download. Every company that has to go through and transport that bandwidth, you have to pay for. And so every company goes up and up and up. There's profit margins added on there. So we have too many companies that we have to go through in order to get to the internet exchange. And even the multiple providers, even of our incumbent provider, they have to buy bandwidth off what's called tier 1 providers. Those are the major carriers. So it's like the PJM of the power industry. And the problem with West Virginia is that, Charlie spoke very well to it, is that our roadbed right-of-way language in Chapter 17 is written very unwelcoming, in a very unwelcoming way. It gives right and authority to regulated utilities to have access to the roadbed right-of-way, and it does not give access to anyone else unless the Commissioner of Highways, which is also our Secretary of Transportation, gives basically a variance. And he is the only person, or that position is the only person that happens to be a male. That position is the only, has the only authority to grant non-utility access to roadbed right-of-way. That language eliminates tier 1 providers from crisscrossing our state to get to other internet exchanges, so they go up and around. You actually have tier 1 providers that go through Morgantown because you have Interstate 68. It goes through West Virginia, but it really doesn't, okay, for the most part. 77 runs right up through most of the state. 64 runs, it covers a lot of ground. To go from Ashburn to Columbus by way of 64 and 77 is a great route. The problem is that non-rate regulated companies tend not to look at West Virginia for an investment because they know the telecommunication history in West Virginia is not good. We are a poster child for a lot of negative publicity. We're not a poster child for a lot of progressive publicity when it comes to telecommunications. So when they see that language, they tend to say, is it worth the fight? We can go around the way and we can make it a lot easier. So what we have done with the councils, we've noticed that we need to get more tier 1 providers in the state. If we have a direct line, direct connection, one fiber carrier all the way to an exchange, your price of bandwidth goes down considerably. You could buy bandwidth for pennies on the dollar of meg, so a nickel per meg at the exchange. And depending on how much of a deal you can strike with the long haul provider or the tier 1 provider, you may be still under 50 cents or $1. And if you want to go and lease dark fiber from a tier 1 provider, which is very common, but we just don't have the ability in West Virginia, then you can lower your cost even more. And it becomes you're selling bandwidth. So if a company can acquire the raw materials, which is bandwidth, and sell it to the end user, and they can acquire it for a lower, less inexpensive price, then they can then pass on those profits to expansion or pass off the savings to the customer. Right now, you would buy bandwidth, a reseller on the wholesale market buys bandwidth $10 to $20 per meg.
What's dark fiber? Will you explain that real quick?
Fiber that has no light through it?
So it's not being used.
Not being used, yes.
There you go.
All of that's dark fiber out there.
There you go.
So the council has worked with the Department of Highways on a project, and one of the things, we started working with them, we developed a memorandum of understanding with them to basically, we had, as the attorneys for highways called it, we had an agreement to come to an agreement. But whatever. And at least it just...
They're all lawyers.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So what we wanted to do is we just wanted to have a timeline that says, look, we're going to agree that we're going to come up with some solution to allow non-rate regulated utilities in the roadbed right-of-ways, because here's the reality. Telephone companies aren't the only ones dealing in telecommunication. You have Google, you have Facebook, Microsoft, you have all these companies that are now dealing in telecommunications and communications data transfer for one specific reason, because their businesses are based upon it, and the telecommunication companies just aren't moving fast enough. And they're not as flush with cash, right? Some of the richest companies in the world are not telecommunication companies. They're Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, is another one. So these companies are the ones that are looking to run fiber. They're looking to connect data centers. They're looking to see how they can get into the marketplace of providing broadband. So West Virginia needs to create a policy or a statute or change the law that we have a message that when the NTIA, National Telecommunications, I don't know what I stands for, but probably the A stands for administration. When they come across every year and they put out their 50 states and right-of-way policies and laws, we don't want to be the one policy that says nobody but utilities is allowed in the right-of-ways. We want to be a policy that says we allow utilities in the right-of-way, we allow non-rate regulated utilities in the right-of-way, we have a lease structure, it's X number of dollars for controlled access, non-controlled access, and also we'll take dark fiber in lieu of payment for your lease. So we'll mitigate your cost of being in the right-of-way. You just give the state of West Virginia dark fiber. If the state of West Virginia has dark fiber, well then guess what? The state of West Virginia has a direct line that they own that they're not paying anything for into the internet exchange, whatever it may be, Ashburn, Columbus, or Pittsburgh. If that happens, then the state of West Virginia can then provide bandwidth and networking to the state capital. They can provide bandwidth and networking to WebNet, which is what provides internet and bandwidth to all government organizations, schools, universities. So we drop the cost of access and bandwidth, which is really, really high.
DMVs?
Sure, I mean, they're a government organization. It's just the more tier 1 providers we have in the state, the more competitive we're going to be, because we can actually buy bandwidth at a less expensive rate. Would you agree?
Absolutely, absolutely. Alpha leases a 10 gig circuit from Ashburn, and the price that you mentioned is spot on.
Mm-hmm. It's West Virginia schools pay about $4 a meg for service. State of Montana, there's 500,000 people. They pay a nickel. So right now, I mean, if you are paying attention to the news, I think you know about it even if you weren't paying attention. The schools are on strike, right? Our teachers are one of the lowest paid teachers in the country. Which is something we have to fix. We have to find efficiencies. We have to look at it just like a business. We have to say, where can we improve our efficiencies? Where can we cut costs? And where can we pass those costs on to something, or pass that savings on to something else? If you're paying $4 a meg, and you could be paying a nickel or even a dime per meg, the amount of millions of dollars of savings that you can then take and pass that on to improving the income of your personnel in just one thing. I mean, that's just one thing. It's right there. It's just a matter of changing policy.
It's huge. It'd pay for itself. Before we move to Charlie, I want to stay with you, Rob. You talked about federal data out in the hall a little bit about what the federal data report was, but you guys are coming out with a third-party data report as well. Could you talk to us about the federal data report, what you guys are doing, and also how the students here could be involved in submitting stuff for your data research?
Sure. So the FCC does what's called a broadband report. They did a broadband report, I think the last one was 2016, right? Yes. Yeah, I should know that, right? I'm asking you guys as if you know it. I think it was 2016 when it came out, and it hasn't come out since until February 2nd, I think was the most recent one. It uses what's called 477 data. Every provider that provides internet service on a biannual basis, they have to submit 477 data. Basically, they have to say where and what census blocks do they provide service and what level of service are they providing. we wrote, there was an open comment period because they're trying to change the way that they aggregate data and how they can get more accurate data. And the council wrote in and some advisements about how we could improve that. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But basically, it's an honor system where the companies are saying that they provide a certain level of service in a census block. The reason the census block is a key is that if you provide service to one household in that census block, the whole census block is considered served. That's a broken model. There's argument that the providers need to be providing data at an address level. Lobbyists argue that that's too difficult for the providers to do reporting at an address level. However, they do bill at the address level, so kind of a little bit of a contradiction there. Either way, it is what it is, and that's what's happened. And that's basically, if you were to see the FCC report and wondering how they receive their data or how they measure broadband on a national level, that's how it is done. The problem is it's in one piece of data set. There's no other information that can be used as a comparative analysis with the 477 data. So the council, we started mapping broadband, and it hadn't been mapped since 2014. That's actually 2014 is when the last report came out. No, it wasn't 2016. It's been a couple of years. But the Broadband Council said we need to start mapping. We hadn't mapped since 2014. We started mapping in 2016. The other thing we started doing is that we created a web application or a speed test portal. Basically, it's on our website. It's the main thing on our website. You go to our website, you can take a speed test, and it'll GPS locate your speed test or your address wherever you are. It'll tell us who's providing that service, what was your maximum upload speed, what was your maximum download speed, and then that automatically goes into a data set. And at the end of March, we're going to publish our first, what we'll call a West Virginia State Broadband Report, Broadband Speed Report. And what we also did to the FCC is we submitted a conceptual idea that each state has an agency that's kind of like parallel to what the Broadband Enhancement Council is. And so each state should be allowed to submit ancillary comparable data that the FCC could look at against the 477. There's inaccuracies with both, right? There's inaccuracies with the 477 data because it's measured at the census block level. There's inaccuracies with the speed test data because, well, there's no way for us to know if somebody was running 3 Netflix movies while the 4th person in the room was doing a speed test, right? So I mean, there's just, you're never going to have a 100% accurate measurement, but if you have an area that says they received 25 by 3 megs worth of service, and you're having, let's say you have 100 speed tests in that same census block, and all those speed tests average at between 1 and 3 megs, something is probably not correct in that estimate. So we could probably make an assessment that maybe it's not 25.3 in that area, so maybe we take that off the list as being served by broadband. So we'll have that report out at the end of March, and then we'll go and deliver it to the FCC and walk them through the report. And what we hope to achieve is a dialogue with the FCC that every quarter we'll provide this report, and every quarter the FCC hopefully will give us feedback as far as, you know, this is data we can use, this is data we can't use, we'd like to see more of this, less of this, and come to some model that they can formulate and put out, and then have other states produce data that is similar to ours.
It's fantastic. I do want to open it up to questions from the audience as well, to hear from our students. Everyone, is anybody have questions dealing with fiber connectivity or internet in West Virginia, where we're going? Yes.
So Rob, you were talking about the 477, the FCC reports. Are those what like the USDA bases their identification of communities that are eligible for broadband grants, such as the Community Connect grant has a limit, or it only serves, or it only provides funds for underserved or unserved communities. So is that defined on the census block, like on that FCC report?
And-
or can communities submit their own data?
And will you state your name?
Allison Chandler.
And Allison.
Yes and no.
Okay.
Initially, yes. Your best case in going after Community Connect specifically is to utilize the FCC broadband map to show where areas that aren't served and are served. However, the FCC does allow for you to do surveys and have residents sign a sheet of paper that says, I only have X number of meg service, or I have this level of service, but I only receive X megs. With the Broadband Enhancement Council, we can, at some point, we'll be able to provide, if somebody's going after Community Connect grant and they're arguing against the 477 data, the council can provide any speed testing data that we have in the area that you're looking at trying to get funding for. It becomes a issue that when you do put your application in, is the provider in that area going to challenge your application? That's the only question that comes up. If they're saying that they do have service, they're going to challenge it. The best thing I can recommend to you is that the more evidence that you have when submitting an application to contest the level of service that is actually being quoted in the FCC 477 report and what is actually being received by the residents in those areas, is just have more evidence, have more, I don't want to say petitions, but just statements that were signed by those individuals, and more data that you have, like from what the council can do. So it's kind of like yes and no.
Questions? Yes.
This is basically a question for the whole panel. I know we've been talking a lot about fiber optic lines and such. However, for a lot of West Virginians, they basically live in the middle of nowhere. And so the prospects of them actually having a line like that ran near enough to them to actually receive fiber optic connection is next to none. And so I was wondering what each of your thoughts were about. I know that satellite internet is a thing, and I think HughesNet actually bought most of the other satellite providers. But I also know that it's extremely expensive to use satellite internet. And do you see any advancement in that type of technology in order to help West Virginians and actually make it affordable?
It depends. If you ask Elon Musk, yes.
True.
If you look at physics, I don't know how he's going to do it. But then again, I don't know how he's done a lot of things that he's done. If he does, or if that company does create a technology that gets over the latency issue of satellite connectivity, that'd be awesome, because that's ubiquitous coverage. The reality that is fiber going to be run to homes everywhere, because 10 years ago we didn't improve the regulations on the CAF funding and what you need to invest in. You're never going to get fiber in some of those areas. And you could look at areas that don't have cable franchises. Those are probably the areas that they're never going to have fiber, because if cable could make money doing it, they would already be there. The cool thing is you do have these advancements that are trying to be made in the satellite area, but there's also tremendous advancements being made in the wireless area. Like 4 years ago, I was totally against wireless. It wasn't there. Over the past 3 or 4 years, it has made leaps and bounds. The technology has gone from straight line of sight to near line of sight to non-line of sight. There's different spectrums and different types of technology that you can use to deliver service to the end customer. For instance, TV white space is a big thing Microsoft is investing in and has been beating the drum, and they're going to continue to beat the drum. I know that there's a company in West Virginia that's testing it, and a 5-mile span, aeronautical miles, is that how you say it? And they're able to deliver 50 megs up and down over TV white space. There are some things that are going to happen with LTE and fixed wireless broadband. So there's a difference between wireless mobile and wireless fixed wireless broadband. Mobile obviously is cellular, it's more expensive to operate. Fixed wireless is a little less expensive, and it requires a receiver on one end that's fixed, obviously the name fixed wireless, and a base station or radio on the other end. They're creating LTE in this area, in the 2.5 spectrum. in the 3.5 spectrum. And I realize 3.5 is what I've always said, but apparently if you're in the industry, you say 3.5. I was at the FCC 2 weeks ago, and that's what they kept saying, so apparently that's how you say it. But there's going to be some things that are happening right now in the 3.5 area. They're looking at in 2020 changing the rules of how they license 3.5. And what's scary is that they're looking at, right now, the license for the 3.5 spectrum is small at the census block level, and it's for a 10-year period. What they're looking at doing is they're looking at expanding it so they're similar to the cellular spectrum, which all the big carriers own, not a bad thing, but it becomes a bad thing for the small to medium-sized wireless providers that you have in all of rural America that are serving customers. If they want to go to a technology like LTE, which you can serve 100 to 300 megs worth of service, and depending on next third, fourth generation, you may be able to get to a gig, they won't be able to buy the spectrum or afford the spectrum because they'll have to buy an area that is so large. So that's something that we're keeping our eye on. The other thing that is, there's a House Bill 4357, I think is the number of it, and it allows for wireless transmitters to be placed on all existing telecommunications poles, so utility poles, towers, whatever it may be, that it's in the public right-of-way. And you can be a carrier by virtue of utility or non-utility. You're just providing wireless service, and you can put a radio on there and provide service. The advantage to that bill is that there is a technology in the 60 gigahertz spectrum that can provide gig connection. Google, who was doing fiber to the premise in a lot of, what was that Google Fiber project called? Google Fiber. And what they were finding was right-of-way issues, make-ready issues, attachment to the poles was becoming too expensive to deploy. So they went and started investigating into the wireless. So they're actually distributing in some of these cities, they're doing it on 60 gigahertz and providing gigabit connections. The problem is that you've got like half mile to 3/4 of a mile distance that you can operate that radio. But if you can put a radio every half mile or 3/4 of a mile on top of a pole and you have access and you only have to pay $20 a year, DOH doesn't like that one. Then you can spread coverage out relatively quickly. So there's multiple technologies. There's not a silver bullet that's going to solve our broadband problem, except for the tier 1 providers. We've got to have that. But from a last mile perspective, it's going to be a hybrid setup.
I'm not going to disagree with anything that Rob said, but I'm going to give you a different perspective just for fun. Here's the problem when we talk about utility companies being able to do this at a profit. It really comes down to how quickly do you want to recover your money? How quickly do you want to recover the investment? And I doubt that any of these guys want to see less than 36-month recovery period. And there are all kinds of things that are going on in the industry simultaneously that that drive this behavior. One of the things that's happening is the cable companies own now more than 50% of all of the broadband customers in the United States. And I think they crossed that bridge about a year ago somewhere. I think is where that hit. Now here's what's also happening. They're losing customers at the rate, subscribers for cable TV. They're losing customers at a rate of about 250,000 a quarter. Okay? So they have what they call triple play, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that. That means you get your broadband, you get your cable TV, and you get your telephone, and by the time you add a sports package and you get HBO, it's really a substantial amount of money. I think our cable bill is now more than our mortgage used to be. And so people are getting sensitive to those prices, and so they're starting to cut the cord and starting to stream. And that is driving the revenue down for these big cable companies like Comcast and like Suddenlink and Charter. But you know, when you pay your CEO $100 million a year, you know, you got to find that money someplace. And so Comcast said about a year ago that the price of retail internet is undervalued, and they expect to double the cost of their internet in the next year. And that's because people are not buying their other things anymore. Show of hands, how many people here have a landline?
We do, because it comes with the triple package.
Okay, but other than that, see, that's the point. You know, people like Frontier spent like $8 billion to buy these old Verizon operating companies, and all they've got is a pocket full of rusting infrastructure. Literally, I mean, it's just in horrible shape. There was a big problem here in West Virginia. So last year's big win in the internet for West Virginia was House Bill 3093. And one of the provisions of 3093 allowed people, 20 or more persons, to create a co-op. And there was also a pilot project in there that allowed 2 municipalities or other subdivisions of government to create co-ops. So the real cost of deploying this fiber isn't all that bad. The real problem is, how quickly do you want to get that investment back? So who's got a piece of fiber? Okay. That fiber cost about $1.35 a foot. And that's 144 strands. I mean, that's a boatload of fiber. Problem is, you know, 12 strands of fiber cost about a nickel. So you just go ahead and spend the money and buy a little more to begin with. Now, putting it in the ground gets to be the expensive part, or hanging it on the poles and make ready. That gets to be the expensive part. But if you form a co-op, you don't have to get your money back in 36 months. In fact, you may not care about getting your money back in 20 years. The problem gets to be, how long do you get to pay it back? And what were the loans on that last thing, Rob? Was it 10 years or 20 years on the EDA
no,
loans?
they'll amortize them for 20.
Yeah. So now a community could go out and get a 20-year loan to build their own fiber. So it's like buying a car. You know, you're going to pay for it in 36 months. Well, you know, that's a chunk. Going to pay for it in 20 years? Okay. You know, I can do that, and I think that's really going to be a big driver. Now, you know, Rob's talking about wireless, and he's absolutely right, but even the wireless needs a backhaul. So what might happen in smaller communities is you might run the wireless until you into places where you've got the population density to afford to deploy the fiber, and in area places where the guy lives on the backside of the ridge or up the hollow or someplace like that where you can't get to that, you put up some sort of a tower, or you put up some sort of a broadcast. But I think that we're going to. I understand you had a lot of applications for those co-ops last year, didn't you? Or were you handling that? Okay. I had a member of the House of Delegates this week tell me that they'd had a lot of interest in the communities forming the co-ops. And I've been working with a community that consists of 5 incorporated areas and a lot of unincorporated areas that want to build their own fiber and use these funding mechanisms. And their vision is that if we can find some content providers, multiple providers, we'll simply lease the fiber back to them. So there's another model where the community owns the fiber and leases it back to content providers.
It's fascinating. That question was asked a long time ago dealing with telephones in the United States, and they created the National Telecom Act, which ran telephone wire to every single home in the United States. So the question becomes, do you look at fiber broadband as essential, like a utility that everyone is required to have and as important as electricity and water, or do you look at it that can only be provided by the private market? I think it's a hybrid. I think that in larger, denser populations, you have the ability for private market competition. In rural areas where no private market is ever going to go to, you look at it as a sense of the government needs to get involved to help. and it can't pick winners and losers. It can't just help one company. And in the history of West Virginia, that's all it's ever done. And that's where we find ourselves. So that's a fascinating question. It's been asked a million times in the legislature. We don't have much time left, so we'll limit one more question and some brief goodbye remarks in a sense, and then go from there. Does anybody else have a final question? Yes, sir.
I know we've been talking about this perspective, whether it's a utility, whether it's like a universal access for all. Have there been like research or plans for research to coincide with this expansion? So I'm thinking about education. So if we're going and allowing this broadband expansion, are we going to do comparative studies about empowering communities to now have access to do more things with education that might have an outcome with our performance levels?
I don't know if there is a research study that's actually proven it. It's kind of like you lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, right? So we know that you may not have, in a community, you may have there's a lot of different variables here. So if you take a community that doesn't have broadband right now and doesn't have connectivity, and you bring broadband to that community, there's a lot of education that needs to happen from an adoption standpoint. So why, if I never had broadband, why do I need it? Other than to watch Netflix, right? So there's the other rub. How do you get it so it's just specifically educational? And so there, it goes back to that statement. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. In our project, that was one of the things that we had to answer on our question was, what is the economic impact going to be if you bring broadband to these areas that have no service? One of the things that we stated is that you'll have ability for the students at the school system to be able to do homework, so you close the homework gap, right? But there's no guarantee that they'll do that. There's no guarantee that they'll use it in that manner. You almost have to look at broadband in unserved areas as a speculative build, right? Where you don't really want to do that. You don't really want to say if you build it, they will come. But that's really, not having broadband, you know what the answer is. You're not going to have access, and you're not going to have the ability to basically choose to use that for educational aspect or career training or marketing if you're a business or whatever it may be. But if you do have it, you open up the opportunities, and it's basically a decision based on the user if they want to use it in that fashion. But I think it becomes a responsibility of whomever's bringing that connection, whether it's a community-led effort or if it's a company that's bringing it to that area. Obviously, the company having an adoption type process to marketing would help get more people signed up. If it's the community, it's about educating individuals on what they can do besides streaming media or doing your phone over internet. It's educating them on what they can do with an internet connection. Does that answer your question? And
I'll also take a stab at it. I spoke at a national AARP conference about how to get individuals in rural communities to hospitals to get the correct tier of service that they need. CAMC's hospital systems has invested in cameras that they can then put into rural clinics and be able to have optometrists, ophthalmologists, all different level of medical professionals observe a client in the rural communities. In West Virginia, we don't have enough fiber access to connect those cameras back to the hospitals. We're seeing in other states where that has occurred that more people have higher access to health care. And it's really aimed at the elderly population who cannot travel. Homework gap was mentioned by Rob. What that means is a student that gets homework cannot go home and access the internet to complete their homework assignment. We have the largest homework gap of anywhere in the nation in West Virginia. If you think about missing school, whenever you have snow days and such, in certain areas of the state we have it where the kids can go online, take classes online in high school and not have those days counted against them. We are
Starting in third grade.
In third grade they're doing it here?
Academy.
We are unable to do that in the majority of West Virginia. So we have a dicta, we have something in our code that says we must provide equal access for education and opportunity to every single child in West Virginia. And I argued multiple times that we're not doing that because our children don't have the same playing field of broadband fiber optic connectivity. And we're seeing the education of our generation suffer, because that's how we learn. We learn different than anyone else. You see in university apartments where people aren't going into 4-bedroom apartments coming together, they're going single apartments or selling because they've learned to communicate more on this fiber type cloud. And if that's how we're being raised, if that's how we're learning, and we're not providing those tools to our rural communities, to our students throughout West Virginia, other states are going to have an advantage over us, and we are never going to succeed. And that's why this topic is so important. And that's why expanding fiber is so important. And that's why it's amazing the work that Rob is doing, the work that Charlie is doing. Charlie's building a fiber ring throughout all of Charleston, West Virginia. It'll make us one of the fastest cities in the United States because of what he's doing. Rob is getting that internet to the rural communities, and he's using all the resources he can to do that, to bring West Virginia up to speed, to close the homework gap. And he's setting lofty goals because, as he said, if you don't set the lofty goals, you will never achieve anything close to it. So we're very fortunate to have them on our panel today. Those are kind of my closing remarks. Would you all like to add anything else before we leave?
Thank you.
Well, I would like to say that when I was first invited to this panel, I wasn't sure we could talk that long. But apparently we can, and could go longer. And thank you very much for your attention. I saw hardly anybody nod off at all, and I didn't see anybody looking at their phones. Thank you very much. That was very discreet of you. And it's been a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate you.
It's a pleasure. I actually thought that was really interesting.
Thank you.
And I didn't think
Thank
that I would.
Yeah, I know exactly how you feel. But Rob had the audacity to